NBC reporter Richard Engel is kind of panicky about the United States' decision to pull out of Afghanistan. In fact, he argues that we are capitulating. With who? Well, he explains in this next video. Let's take a quick look.
The worst capitulation of Western values in our lifetimes. You left behind. I went to Afghanistan. I arrived a couple of weeks ago. It was a republic backed by the United States, backed by the West. Now it is an emerging Islamic emirate trying to find its way.
It was ruled by the same people who are now in control today prior to us invading Afghanistan. And our purpose of invading Afghanistan initially actually had nothing to do with nation building. The Bush administration had no interest in nation building. In fact, the war was pretty aimless after 2002, and I'll get to more details about that in just a second. But Cenk, I mean, we're talking about reporters who are supposed to engage in straight news reporting. I guess, they're opening it up to some editorial, content and commentary here, but capitulating our value, like what does that even mean?
Yeah, there's so many things wrong with that. And first, let me just say that I'm really disappointed, and it's a funny thing to say because I rip the mainstream media maybe more than anyone, and it's probably louder than anyone. But I see Richard Engel's reporting. Number one, he's in the war zone many times, so I respect that. That takes courage. And number two, he does deliver facts that are important from time to time, including in the middle of that report, he explained that Trump cut out the Afghan government when he was negotiating with the Taliban. And he blamed Trump and Biden, and he was clear about it, but he gave the facts, and the facts are important. And when the Afghan government was cut out of negotiations, that gave the Taliban tremendous, you basically gave him a green light. Don't worry, these guys are irrelevant. You'll steamroll them, and that was done by Trump. Okay, so though he gives facts, but Noam Chomsky talked about this actually in an interview I did with him. He said, it's easy to follow the media. They do have facts. They're not just making things up out of whole cloth. You just have to ignore every piece of framing and editorializing that they don't even sometimes realize is editorializing. And that is the main problem here. And so now let me get to my anger with how absurd that commentary was by Richard Engel. So number one, Western values, what are we talking about here? Now it's easy to say, Western values, democracy, good guys, etc. Taliban are obviously bad guys, we get that. But wait a minute, Western values created the Taliban. We funded and armed the Mujahideen, but the part they never tell you is we also spent a lot of money in media to radicalize Muslims in Afghanistan. There used to be miniskirts in Afghanistan before we started our propaganda. And our propaganda was the communists are atheists and godless, and you have to, and good Muslims believe in violence, and they would cherry pick parts of the Quran, and good Muslims would attack the atheists. So we created that culture in some ways. Now, of course, the culture is also ancient, and it's partly Muslim, partly regional. These are all complicated issues, and to boil it down to, we're Western and we're the good guys. When we invaded the country, we created the Mujahideen in the first place, and they're the bad guys. To break it down in that black and white way, it reminds me of Sam Harris, and it's silly. It's what children do, okay? So now, even worse, Afghanistan was a republic for all these years. What are you talking about? The government, so-called government, the Republic of Afghanistan, collapsed in 11 days. So that shows you, it was never a real government. It was a sham government propped up by the United States military-industrial complex for 20 years. If it was a real republic, it would not have folded in 11 days because there would have been a unifying theme. There would have been energy and motivation and a culture that surrounded it and that believed in it and that would fight for it. But that culture never existed. That republic was always a mirage. And finally, for now, the worst part of it is if you watch the whole several pieces that Engel did out of Afghanistan and Doha, he keeps referring to what the Afghans want. Which Afghans are you talking about? Because it looks like what the Afghans wanted was this, because the Taliban had a lot of local popular support. That's how they took over so easily. He keeps referring to the Afghans as like the three dudes he knows in Kabul who were like, agree with him. And he's like, the Afghans I know, but he doesn't say the Afghans I know. He keeps saying as if the Afghan people are totally against the Taliban. And that's just living in total fantasy land. And that's what makes me disappointed that isn't, let alone your enormous bias, that's not real reporting.
I mean, when you think about how long we've been there, you can understand how some young people in Afghanistan, I mean, I remember watching reports where journalists were asking young Afghans about the United States and what it was doing in the country, and most of them had no idea, right? And so there was this view that the United States was just occupying Afghanistan. And at the same time, I think that the reaction that we've seen from retired generals and from the very pundits that go on cable news just makes it clear that they planned on being in Afghanistan indefinitely, right? I think that there was some acknowledgement that it was this weak, propped up government, the Afghan government, which is now defunct. And the idea was, well, do we really need to be focusing many resources on this in actual nation building when we can just stay here indefinitely? There was just this plan to be there indefinitely. So let's go to the next video. One more clip from Engel's commentary here, and then I want to give you guys some context regarding the war itself, including some of the conversations and debates that took place in the early years of this war. Take a look.
Most Afghans never saw those American troops, did not feel occupied by those American troops, felt comforted by their presence, and their withdrawal emboldened the Taliban, as did the deal signed by President Trump. If you go back, and I'm not trying to get into the blame game in politics, there are many in Washington who can do that. But I was in Doha, I'm in Doha now, when that deal was signed. When the deal was signed by President Trump, the Afghan government, which was already weak, was not even invited. President Trump made a deal directly with the Taliban, and the deal was effectively, the country is yours. That undercut the Afghan government tremendously. And then the government was undercut again profoundly when the Biden administration rapidly withdrew troops with very little coordination with the armed forces of Afghanistan and with the government itself. So it was given a first blow by Trump and then a death blow by the Biden administration.
So Engel, speaking on behalf of the Afghans, argues that the Afghans were comforted by the presence of US military within their own country. And I think that that is honestly an unfair way of describing how Afghans feel. I would much rather hear from Afghans themselves. And when you look at the number of civilian casualties throughout the entirety of this war, you can maybe understand why Afghans would actually be in favor of the US military leaving the country. So let's take a look at this list of casualties. I actually updated this list to include casualties following the suicide bombings that took place at the Kabul airport. But as you can see, I mean, we lost nearly 2,500 or 2,461 to be exact, American service members in the entirety of this war. But take a look at Afghan civilians who died in the 20 years that the United States was engaged in this war, 47,415. These are not Taliban members, these are not insurgent groups, these are Afghan civilians, innocent people who died as a result of our drone strikes, of our missile strikes, of us dropping the mother of all bombs in the country. There are consequences to that. And so you see tens of thousands of Afghan civilians now dead as a result of this war, and to turn around and say, no, I mean, the Afghans were comforted by the presence of the US military. I just think that that is a ridiculous way of describing and also speaking on behalf of Afghans.
No, it's worse than that. That's just flat out propaganda. I mean, that's shameful. And I think even neoliberals have left the building. The only thing left is just the military-industrial complex. And look, when you pay millions of dollars to news networks and advertising when you don't sell anything to consumers, that is a way of doing marketing. You say, hey, news outlets, do my marketing for me. And they don't have to write Richard Engel a memo. They just hire the right people to hire people like Richard Engel who are gonna do pro-war propaganda unwittingly, not realizing he's basically a stooge at this point. And so I told you, look, the facts are correct, but every part of the interpretation of the facts is wrong. Even look, so anybody who watches TYT knows how much I loathe Donald Trump. But when he says Trump cut out the Afghan government from the negotiations, that is true, that's a fact. But then he goes on to editorialize that said to the Taliban, it's your country. No, if the Afghan government was strong and its military was as prepared as we claimed it was, it wouldn't mean that they had to surrender to the Taliban at all. They had 4 times as many men in the Afghan military as the Taliban does. They had billions of dollars in American military equipment. They didn't have to surrender because Trump cut them out of the deal. Look, I'm giving Trump credit there. Like, no, he's not wrong on that. Every part of the editorializing, it's not mixed. It's not like, hey, some is anti-war, some of his comments, and some is pro-war. Every one of it was pro-war. It's so, like, the only people who believe it now, basically people who watch MSNBC and who are just used to just listening to TV and going, oh, okay, I get whatever they tell me. I guess the generals are always right, and Jake Tapper and Rachel Maddow are always right, and Jake Tapper obviously on CNN, and CNN and MSNBC are indistinguishable. But they even lost like Matt Iglesias and Josh Marshall and Kevin Drum. So even a lot of the thinking neoliberals are going, yeah, this coverage was horrific. And so those are 2 excellent examples in that one clip there where he says, oh, the country didn't even know it was occupied. Which part of the country are you talking about? When we were in the valleys, they fought us like lions. They knew they were occupied. That's why they were firing at us. How do you think we lost all those guys? How do you think the Afghan military lost 66,000 men? Because they weren't fighting? Because the Taliban and the locals didn't think they were occupied? That's beyond absurd to say that. And then finally, Anna's right, they're comforted by our troops. That's just mental, man. Your 3 friends in the Capitol in some air-conditioned building were comforted by the troops. The rest of Afghanistan was not comforted by our invasion. The 47,415 civilians dead were not comforted by our invasion, and neither was the overwhelming majority of the country. Richard Engel there, honestly, it was so bad that it tipped over into lying because he gave the impression to, unfortunately, impressionable people that watch television that, oh my God, the Afghans were so ready for democracy and our occupation had worked so well. And if we had just stayed another 20 years, man, Western values would have triumphed. But instead, because we wouldn't do more war, because of Biden and Trump, and by the way, 75% of the American people, well, that's why Western values lost. If we just tried 200 more years of war, it would have worked. So just turn off your TV. This is total, utter propaganda. Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.